Christian Bryant. If this is your first time joining us, I don't know where you've been, but the news doesn't stop and neither do we. So let's get into it. The Supreme Court has been back in the headlines recently, and it's not just because of the historic nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson. There was also a much more controversial story surrounding Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife, Ginni. And the story reveals something kind of shocking about the nation's highest court. Between November of 2020 and the insurrection on January 6th, Ginni Thomas repeatedly texted then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging him to overturn the election results. This raised major red flags, because 1 year later, her husband on the Supreme Court voted to block the release of White House records on the insurrection, which would likely include the texts from his wife. While many critics cried foul at the conflict of interest, legal experts pointed out that, technically, the Supreme Court has no code of ethics. In fact, it's the only court in the nation that doesn't have one. Chief Justice John Roberts explained that he lets justices decide for themselves if they have conflicts of interest. There's no external check on this. The scandal comes at a time when public trust in the Supreme Court is at an all-time low. In a Pew Research study, only 16% of adults say that the justices do a good or excellent job of keeping their own politics out of their rulings. This case has renewed calls from legal experts and prominent Democrats for major reforms of the Supreme Court, one of which would be establishing a code of conduct. The case with Justice Thomas is far from the only prominent potential conflict of interest among the court. The nonprofit Fix the Court documented potential conflicts of interest with every sitting justice and many former justices. For just a couple of examples, the organization Americans for Prosperity spent more than $1 million to help confirm Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who did not recuse herself from the case Americans for Prosperity v. Bonta. She ended up ruling in favor of the organization that aided her confirmation. In another example, although the court ended up not hearing the case, Justice Sotomayor failed to recuse herself from Nicasio v. Viacom, where Penguin Random House was on the side of the respondents. Sotomayor had earned over $3 million from her book contracts with Penguin Random House. About 24 congressional Democrats have called for Chief Justice Roberts to create a code of ethics by later this month, April 28th to be exact. Other Democrats are moving a step further, proposing legislation that would require a judicial ethics code. The bill so far has no Republican support. Republican leaders have been particularly vocal against another proposed reform, expanding the number of justices on the court. The proposal is actually an old one. FDR once tried to expand the court in 1937. Critics accused him of court packing to add more liberals to the court who would support the New Deal. The idea of court expansion only recently gained more popularity among some lawmakers and some legal experts, particularly on the left. But it's worth noting, court packing is not a one-party issue. Republican governors in Georgia and Arizona, both vocal against Supreme Court expansion, have recently expanded their state Supreme Courts in order to create Republican majorities. A third Supreme Court reform that gets a lot of attention is the idea of term limits. This has surprising bipartisan support among legal experts and the general public. Supporters say this would help the court adapt to the current ideological makeup of the country, but opponents argue this might actually make the court more politicized and not less. Nominations would become a regular election issue, and justices might decide opinions to shape their post-judicial political careers. And the Supreme Court nominations do seem to have been more recently politicized. Liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was approved with a 96-3 split in the Senate. Conservative Justice Antonin Scalia was approved 98-0. Boy, times have changed. There seems to be little consensus on what reforms are best or even possible. The Biden administration created a bipartisan team of legal experts to form the Commission on the Supreme Court.
And I will ask them to, over 180 days, come back to me with recommendations as to how to reform the court system, because it's getting out of whack.
Although the report did suggest establishing a code of conduct, even the commission could not definitively decide on a number of suggestions like court packing or term limits. As the Justice Thomas scandal has renewed momentum for reforms, the thorny debate over what those reforms will actually look like presses on. The Ginni Thomas scandal has been a complicated one, and it's still developing. This next story comes from our friends at the Washington Post video team to break down what exactly went down in these controversial texts.
The Justice Department also has a similar responsibility to take this seriously. because this was an attempted coup.
The Washington Post has reported that Virginia Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, was much more involved in efforts to overturn the 2020 election than previously known. Specifically, there are text messages in the possession of the January 6th committee, which show Ginni Thomas coordinating with White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows on strategy when it comes to how to overturn the election, and suggesting that she was in touch with other members of the White House in that effort as well. There are examples of family members of Supreme Court justices being involved in politics. A lot of times, this will involve them being lawyers in their own right. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, Martin Ginsburg, was a renowned tax attorney whose cases sometimes overlapped with what the Supreme Court was looking at. We also have family members, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg's daughter, who have been involved in politics over the years. Generally, though, we haven't seen a situation like Clarence and Ginni Thomas, where the justice's family member is very deeply involved in political activism at the highest levels of government, meaning that there is often overlap between what they're working on and what their spouse or their family member might be ruling on in the nation's highest court.
Thank you.
When judges do not base their decisions on neutral principles, these detrimental policies, with their judicial blessing, often persist for far longer than they otherwise would have.
There has long been a tension here between Ginni Thomas's work and Justice Thomas's work on the Supreme Court. I think what changed with this new report is that we found out not just that she is working on issues that pertain to things the court is doing, but that perhaps the justice was ruling on something and not recusing himself from a case that could impact what we know about his wife's own activities. Supreme Court recusals are a difficult subject because this is something that is solely at the discretion of the justices. They are given guidelines by which to gauge whether they should recuse. That guideline is generally whether their impartiality could reasonably be questioned. But we have seen numerous occasions over the last several decades and throughout history of justices seemingly having things that could reasonably call their impartiality into question and still moving forward with the case. In the case of Clarence Thomas, even unlike previous recusal controversies involving Justice Thomas, this is not a situation in which it's merely about how his impartiality might be questioned. It's about whether this might actually have benefited him and the people in his family because of the implications of how he voted. It's also worth noting here that the vote that Justice Thomas took, the key vote here, didn't actually wind up mattering. He was the only dissenting justice in the case that gave the January 6th committee those records. And so that means eventually we could learn, to the extent those records do reference Ginni Thomas and do involve potentially her communications, at which point I think the conversation about whether the justice should have recused himself will take on a whole new life.
There's enough evidence already, I believe, that he should recuse himself.
Lots of Democrats are calling for Justice Thomas to recuse himself or saying that he should have recused himself in the past. There certainly could be other issues coming up when it comes to the January 6th committee, including how to handle would-be witnesses who are refusing to testify. Democrats in some cases are calling for Thomas's impeachment. Just a few cases, not a whole lot at this point, and that movement hasn't really taken off. Republicans have also been asked about this and have basically punted in a way. They've said that this is up to Justice Thomas.
He's a jurist who has a lot of integrity, and I think he will make that decision.
Which it certainly is, but they have generally avoided talking about the propriety of him staying on this case. And we do have other Republicans that basically say there's no there, that Justice Thomas is a principled man and that he should be allowed to make this decision for himself.